If you look up a list of the largest stadiums in the world, you'll find that there are 11 with an official capacity of over 100,000 people. On top, you have the Narendra Modi Stadium in India, used primarily for cricket. Makes sense, you think. India loves its cricket. Second on the list is North Korea's Nringrado 1st of May Stadium, the one with all the propaganda stunts you vaguely recall seeing in the documentary ones. At the very bottom, at number 11, you note the Melbourne Cricket Ground in Australia, which is also used for Aussie rules football. While Australia having such a large stadium might surprise you, you're more taken aback by entries numbers 3 through 10. All in the United States, all for American football. You know the Yanks love their NFL, but having 8 of the world's 10 largest stadiums for it? You look deeper at the teams that play in those stadiums, and despite your vague recollection of NFL teams from cultural osmosis, none of them ring a bell. Volunteers, Longhorns, Buckeyes? How have I never heard of them before? And what's this one at the bottom? The Alabama Crimson Tide? Alabama has an NFL team? A quick Google search reveals no, they don't. They never did. You look up the largest NFL stadium and find MetLife in New Jersey, but that one only has a capacity of 82,500. That's smaller than any of these listed. Is the US hiding a football league that you didn't know about? That's when you discover America's greatest obsession, college football. Surely it can't just be as the name suggests. Is it really just university athletics? If that's so, how can the stadiums be so big? How can they be filled every night? How can amateur sports not only rival, but outflank professional sports to such a high degree? Well, my friend, in this video, I'll show you that not only do your eyes not deceive you, but how we got to this point in the first place. Hi, I'm K-Shy, and today I'll be answering the question, why is college football so popular in America? As you can tell by the video's length, this is going to be a comprehensive deep dive, one that's going to require a multitude of detours and tangents to fully answer. That starts with a crash course on the history of American football itself and its connection to 2 other types of football. For most of its history, the term football was merely a catch-all for any sport that was played on foot, as opposed to on horseback in sports like polo. The number of players, field size, and even objectives varied greatly. Some instances of games were literally between 2 towns, as in residents of one town tried to get the ball into their settlement, while residents of one town over tried to do the same with that exact same ball. They didn't really bother with rules per se, so many of said games would end up just turning into a massive brawl. That's how many games would be played for almost a millennia until the 19th century, when football players wished to make a game where you could actually see both goals and not get decked in the process. The first implementation of such games came between universities in southern England as a form of exercise and discipline for students. Different universities would still have different rules for their version of football, meaning that rules of a match between 2 schools would differ from game to game. Sometimes as a form of compromise, 2 rules would even switch mid-game. While not as extreme as the football games of yore, the slight differences in rules led to calls for a standardization of the game and a concrete, universal set of laws for everyone. This would prove to be easier said than done, as there was a major disagreement between teams. How are you allowed to handle the ball? Some schools said you should only be allowed to kick the ball, while others preferred to pick it up and run with it. Such disagreements came to a head in 1863 when a group of London-based schools, all on the kick-only side of the argument, would form an association to write up a common set of rules for them to follow. These laws of the game were called the laws of the game. While there were older attempts to codify the sport, these laws would prove to last. This code would eventually be named after the group that created it, association football, commonly known as just football or soccer, depending on where you're from. The pro-holding teams would soon form their own association and write up a different code in 1871, naming their version of football after the city that claims to have invented it, rugby. While soccer and rugby would forever diverge into 2 separate sports, in America they would soon converge to make something new. Much like England, America developed a variety of football codes during the colonial and pre-Civil War eras. Also much like England, many were of the informal variety that would eventually turn into brawls. These types of mob football, as they were called, were viewed as a disturbance to the public order, and in the 1860s, many universities would ban such games on their campus. One of these was a Cambridge, Massachusetts school that many of you are probably very familiar with, Harvard University. In 1862, in response to a mob football ban the previous year, the students of Harvard would go about making a more organized form of football. This included forming the very first organized football club of any kind in the United States, the Oneida Football Club. Predating both soccer and rugby's founding codes, Oneida would instead create its own rule set known as the Boston Game, named after the famous Boston Commons where the game was played. This form of football was a bit of a hybrid between soccer and rugby, one I'll explain a little further in a couple chapters. In its first iteration, though, Oneida lacked a formal opponent. This meant that games were either played amongst themselves or against members of the public who were willing to play them. In the 3 years that Oneida operated, not only did they go undefeated against the non-members, they weren't even scored against once. It probably didn't help that there was a civil war going on at the time, so the caliber of their opponents wasn't ideal. While the Oneida Football Club would cease operations in 1865, Harvard wasn't willing to abandon the Boston Game yet. They just needed to find the right opportunity to bring it back. In the meantime, a different university in New Jersey was planning its own football scheme. Rutgers University had an ongoing rivalry with fellow Garden State establishment Princeton, one that extended to their athletics and one they were very much the underdog. A particularly stinging example came in 1866, when Rutgers were humiliated in a collegiate baseball game in which Princeton beat them 40 runs to 2. Rutgers, naturally, wanted revenge. That opportunity came 3 years later on November 6, 1869, where the two schools would meet on Rutgers' ground. Perhaps they didn't know it at the time, but this game would be the birth of America's favorite sport. The Princeton Tigers and Rutgers, at the time called the Queensmen, would play on a different version of football most Americans would be familiar with today. It was based off the 1863 laws of the game, meaning it was technically a game of soccer. There were some modifications to this particular game, however. First, instead of the 11-man squad most soccer players are familiar with today, this 1869 game would have 25 players on each team. Second, the game would allow the usage of hands, not to hold the ball as in rugby, but merely to hit it hand of God style. Thirdly, rather than a game ending after a certain amount of time has elapsed, multiple games would be played in succession, each ending when one team scores a goal. First team to get 6 goals wins it all. With the rules established, the 50 players and around 100 spectators gathered around the field to watch history happen. The following is an abridged account by John W. Herbert, one of the Rutgers players at the time. Princeton would win the toss to get the ball first, but after a bad kick, Rutgers would capitalize and score within the first 5 minutes of the game. The schools would each take turns scoring goals, tying the game 2-2 after 4 scores. Rutgers would break this tit-for-tat by scoring both the 5th and 6th goals, but while attempting a hat trick, tragedy struck Rutgers and one of its players got confused in the chaos, accidentally kicking the ball towards his own goal. This particular kick was blocked, but it allowed Princeton to line up a shot and score. Frazzled, Rutgers would allow Princeton to score again just a couple minutes later. The score was tied 4-4 with momentum on Princeton's side. If they didn't change course, Rutgers would literally be beaten at their own game. That's when the team's captain had an epiphany. Noting the allotment of hands for striking the ball, Princeton was using taller players than Rutgers to help the ball fly further. To counter this, he told players to keep the ball as low as possible to prevent Princeton from taking advantage. The gambit paid off as Princeton was unable to stop the next 2 goals by Rutgers. The game ended 6-4. Rutgers won. A week later, the two schools would face off again, this time on Princeton's campus and with Princeton's own version of football. Whatever revenge Rutgers enacted in the first game was quickly undone here as they lost 8-0. That ultimately didn't matter though, as these 2 games would form the inaugural season of college football. Rutgers was forever changed by that first game. It is often considered the birthplace of college football, and the players' usage of scarlet-red bandanas to distinguish themselves from their Princeton opponents would eventually lead the school to adopt its modern nickname, the Scarlet Knights. While a radically different code from the modern game, these 2 1869 games were the first where 2 schools would face each other in America, and soon the game would evolve in ways neither school at the time could imagine. The schools would meet again the next year, with the New York-based Columbia University joining the fray. No games would be played in 1871, but in 72 the 3 schools would play again alongside the Stevens Institute and Yale University. The 1873 season proved to be pivotal as the number of participants almost tripled and made the game international. One of the participants of that season was the historical Eton College, who came over from England to play a game against Yale. Yale would beat Eton 2-1, marking the first and only time an English university participated in college football. What allowed this game in the first place was a consolidation of the rules. Much like the inaugural season, the games prior to 1873 were often played by the rules of whatever school hosted each game. To alleviate issues, representatives from Rutgers, Princeton, Columbia, and Yale would meet in New York to draft up a common set of rules for all schools to play. They ultimately settled on a game that was based off of the 1863 laws of the game. With the rules set, college football was destined to become college soccer. That is, if it wasn't for one school. See, there was supposed to be a 5th team at that meeting, one that would be making their debut in the competition that year. However, they ultimately refused to attend as they wanted to continue playing their own version of the game. That school, of course, was our old friend Harvard. Harvard was wishing to bring back their Boston game that they invented 11 years prior and was looking for a real opponent to play against. The other schools declined their offer, effectively locking them out of the 73 season. While other schools would play against the likes of Eton, it wouldn't be long until another foreign school would give Harvard the game they long yearned for. At the same time as America was priming to be a soccer nation, the Great White North was busy developing their own form of football. Canada actually beat the US to the punch in hosting any regulated form of football. In 1861, the seemingly redundantly named University College in Toronto held a practice match between students, though the exact rules of that particular game seem to be lost to history. Later games were well more documented, and while the first few games technically predated the 1871 laws of football, Canada's game more resembled rugby than it did soccer, with many schools and even a few professional teams adopting said laws when they finally came out. That said, some schools were faster to adopt than others. One early adopter was Montreal's McGill University, who after struggling to find other Canadian teams to play them for a few years, looked internationally for competition. They found their target in 1874 when they formally challenged, wouldn't you know it, Harvard to a game of rugby. McGill would in turn agree to play the Boston game, finally giving Harvard the challenger they so craved and would mark an inflection point in college football. The two games would be played on back-to-back days starting on May 14, 1874. As Harvard was the host, it was decided that the two schools would play the Boston game first. I early promised to explain the rules of the Boston game, so here's the rundown. Most of the Boston game is pretty similar to soccer, between 10 to 15 players per team, a field whose legal dimensions are similar to the modern-day soccer pitch, and for the most part you are not allowed to touch the ball with your hands, only with your feet. There were a few quirks that deviated from the laws of the game, however. First, there were no goalposts that the ball had to go through in order for a goal to be scored. Instead, the entire end boundary of each side was the team's respective goal line. Any ball that crossed said line, outside of a fair kick to resume play when the ball goes out of bounds, would count as a goal. A second and more noteworthy difference was an exception to the kick-only rule. If a player with the ball was actively being pursued by an opponent, they were allowed to pick up and carry the ball in their arms, much like you would in rugby. They could even pass it to their teammates, but would need to drop the ball and return to kicking if their pursuer stopped. With the game rules set, Harvard and McGill played the first official match of the Boston game in front of 500 spectators. While both teams fought gallantly, McGill's inexperience in the code ultimately led them losing the game 3-0. Harvard remained the undefeated champion of the game that they invented. They still do to this day, because the game they would play the next day would become their new favorite. May 15th, same teams, same field, but this time rugby football. I buried the lead earlier when I talked about the split between soccer and rugby. While kicking versus holding distinction was the primary reason for the schism, it wasn't the only one. Another major difference was the policy on hacking, which is basically attempting to trip your opponent by kicking their shin. Soccer explicitly banned the practice, and subsequently so did every other version of it that was in the United States, including the Boston game. Rugby, on the other hand, permitted the tactic. While it too would be banned eventually, this one decision would make rugby and the future American football a much more contact-heavy sport than soccer. There was another big distinction: how points were scored. In soccer, you simply kicked the ball between the goalposts to score. In rugby, it wasn't as simple. Along with the goal kick, a player would also need to run the ball out of their opponent's end boundary. This is called a try. While modern-day rugby, both union and league, have different scoring values for each of these plays, the original rules had them inextricably linked. While a try itself wasn't worth anything, it was a prerequisite before a player could try and kick a goal. The similarities between rugby and the Boston game, along with looser rules on physical contact, allowed Harvard to adapt to McGill's rules much better than vice versa, with the first ever rugby match played in the United States resulting in a scoreless draw. Despite the anticlimactic finish, Harvard would fall in love with the game, and especially the try system. This would lead them to finally let go of the Boston game and switch to a game other people played. A rematch would occur on October 23rd of that year, this time on McGill's territory. While this game also saw no goals, it did see Harvard's 3 tries to McGill's 0, leading Harvard to win the tiebreaker. The 1875 season would be even stronger for Harvard, having challenged some of their fellow Americans to the game. The first was Tufts University. They played 2 games, a June 4th game where Tufts won 1-0, and an October 27th game where Harvard won 1-0. The second was a more consequential one, a November 13th match with Yale. Yale, previously committing to play by soccer rules, agreed to play Harvard at rugby with a few small concessions, primarily using a round, soccer-like ball rather than a more oblong ball that rugby used at the time. Despite losing 4-0, Yale would too fall in love with the game, accounting for its more frequent scoring opportunities and rougher gameplay. The following year, in 1876, the same teams, sans Rutgers, that met just 3 years earlier to commit to play soccer, met again with Harvard and Boston to commit to playing rugby. They also agreed to one rule deviation from the 1871 laws of rugby. A try itself would be worth 1 point, alongside the 1-point goal. America's brief stint with soccer being the definitive football code was over, and soon rugby took over. Rugby's reign would prove to be equally short, however, as that same year, a man would be entering the picture that would be finally turning American football into the game it is today. A man by the name of Walter Camp. When Walter Chauncey Camp became a freshman at Yale University in 1876, the school's athletic department offered only 3 sports: track and field, baseball, and the newly incorporated rugby football. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for students to participate in multiple collegiate sports at the same time, and as there was no schedule conflict regarding any, Camp decided to participate in all 3. And despite coach concerns regarding his smaller stature compared to other players, Camp would prove to be a prodigy in all 3. His favorite, no doubt, was football, quickly rising up the team hierarchy to eventually become the team captain in his junior year. For all his love of the current game, Camp felt that football was lacking and would often make proposals to changes in the sport in ways that he saw fit. While he was still a student, none of his proposals would be approved by any of the schools. When Camp graduated Yale in 1880, however, he built up a reputation and soon positioned himself to where almost all of his decisions on the game would be approved without question. Walter Camp was on the cusp of a revolution in American football that would cement himself in history, a 3-year endeavor to turn the sport from completely unrecognizable to us today to almost exactly like the modern game. Hold on, because things are about to go fast. His first 2 changes came in 1880. First, a reduction in the number of active players. The standard rugby team at the time consisted of 15 players, a number that rugby union still has today. Camp brought it back down to 11 as soccer did even then. His second change was even more noteworthy, a change in the start of play. Previously, whenever a ball was dropped or otherwise declared dead, play would resume in a scrum, which is in essence a glorified huddle/dog pile where players would fight to get the ball. Camp would replace it with what he would call a scrimmage. Wherever the ball was called dead, an imaginary transverse line would be called on the field called the line of scrimmage. Players of either team would position themselves on their respective side of the line and would not be allowed to cross the line until play began. 7 of the 11 players would line up on the line of scrimmage, who would be doing the tussling among their opponent's 7 to either go after or defend the ball carrier. The other 4, especially for the ball carrying team, would have specialized roles. One, in essence, would be used as a spare to either help the scrimmage or the players in the back depending on the team's need. The other 3 would play in the back, initially far from the main action to help them run the ball easier. The farthest from the action was dubbed the fullback. Halfway between him and the line was the halfback, and halfway between him and the line was the quarterback. Play would begin when the centermost player in the line of scrimmage, appropriately dubbed the center, would roll the ball back, or snap, to the quarterback, who would in turn decide how to proceed with play. Camp believed this setup would speed up the game and not be bogged down by excessive scuffling as rugby would be. These initial changes seemed to hit their mark, as all of them still remain in the game to this day. Camp, however, was not finished. In 1881, he would impose even more changes to the game, this time on the field itself. Field sizes often varied in the early game of rugby, so Camp set about setting a standard size. After much deliberation, a dimension of 360 by 160 feet, about 110 by 49 meters, was settled upon, a size that all American football fields are today, though at the time all of the field was considered to be between the goal lines. That year, Camp would also see a flaw in one of the decisions he made. The scrimmage system he designed to speed up the game actually was slowing it down, as Princeton exploited the system by moving up the field by small amounts, downing the ball, and then resetting play indefinitely. To remedy this, Camp would institute 2 more changes to the sport that would give the family of football American football is in its name. First, instead of having as many attempts as you want to move the ball as much or little as you wish, a team would now have a limited number of attempts to move the ball a minimum distance. Successfully get the ball across, you get a new batch of attempts to move the same distance. Fail, and you forfeit the ball right at the spot of the last attempt. Camp would settle on 3 attempts to move 15 feet, which is about 4.5 meters or 5 yards. Since most attempts ended with the ball dropping down on the ground, this type of action play would become known as the down and distance system. To assist in measuring, a second change was implemented. A series of transverse lines would be drawn on the field, each 5 meters apart from one another, to gauge how far a team traveled and how much farther they needed to go. These lines reminded people of a type of metal grate used for cooking food called a gridiron. From that point forward, American football officially transitioned from rugby football to gridiron football. Walter Camp's final big innovation came in 1883, and it changed how scoring worked in football. The old system had a try worth 1 point and a goal worth another. Camp would tinker around with the scoring of the game before settling on certain values. The tries themselves would soon be worth 4 points. Due to the nature of the ball touching down on the ground past the goal line, These tries would soon be referred to as touchdowns. A 4-point touchdown could be converted into 6 with a successful kick into the field goal. A field goal could also be attempted without a touchdown for only 5 points. Finally, a completely new way to score was added for the team without the ball. If you force the ball-carrying team to drop or down the ball behind their own goal line, you'll get 2 points and possession of the ball in the next play. Since this was previously considered a safe way to restart play if you were being chased, this score would be christened the safety. All these plays still exist today, albeit most having a different value attached. These scores would quite literally have a magnitudinal effect on the game. In 1882, prior to the point switch, Yale would beat Wesleyan University 9-0. In 1883, after the switch, Yale would beat Wesleyan 90-0. Most of Camp's later changes to the game would be minor, with the most notable being an establishment of 45-minute halves for the games in 1886. That said, he did do enough to earn him the nickname the father of American football. The fast-paced and high-scoring game he developed would prove to be quite entertaining to watch and fun to play. The sport in the following decades would also spread outside of New England, where it was confined all this time, and began to be played across the country. I cannot emphasize enough how much Walter Camp's code blew up. In 1880, when he started his changes, 16 colleges were playing football amongst themselves. By 1905, that number was 149. The game even briefly went international. The first college football game outside of the United States took place in 1897 between American students of 2 Parisian schools, l'École des Beaux-Arts and l'Académie Julian. Pardon my French. It wasn't all hunky-dory though, as football would soon face its biggest obstacle in its history. In 1904, many of the big football schools would meet again, but this time it wasn't at a random hotel, but inside the White House with the namesake of everyone's favorite children's toy, President Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy himself was a massive fan of football that Camp developed, so it may come as a surprise to you that he gathered the schools together and gave them an ultimatum that if not followed through on, would result in him banning the game outright. The schools themselves were not surprised by this, as they knew exactly why Roosevelt gave them such a warning. Football had a literal fatal flaw. In making the game more exciting, it also became extremely dangerous. In the year this meeting was called, not only would 159 players be injured, 18 of them would lose their life on the field. The year after, another 20. This risk turned off many players, spectators, and schools alike from the sport. A big issue was the sport's defining down and distance system. Before, where players could down each other with some restraint, as you had a whole field to stop your opponent, now the offense would fight over inches and the defense would attempt to stop running players right at the spot of contact. Previous attempts were made to mitigate these disasters, most notably the 1896 introduction of the punt, where instead of attempting a most likely futile final down and turning the ball over to the opponent in a disadvantageous position, a team could forfeit the ball by kicking as far away from their own goal as possible and making it harder for them to score. The punt, while helpful, had a minuscule effect on safety, and it was clear that drastic action was needed. Roosevelt mercifully gave these schools an opportunity to improve safety. 2 years after that meeting and a whole lot of workshopping, the colleges would form an organization with the express goal of regulating the sport, including the safety of its players. That organization is the National Collegiate Athletics Association, or the NCAA. Before I continue, I need to bring up 2 important issues regarding the topic I just brought up. They're sad, but important, and I have no better place to bring them up than now. 1. The issues of injuries and even death, even to this day, have not been completely eradicated. 2. The NCAA is not a flawless organization. On the first point, particularly on deaths, the effects were not immediate. Even as late as the 1931 season, the sport would see a sudden spike in casualties when a jaw-dropping 40 players would die on the field. Many of these, unlike the pre-NCAA games, were mainly due to factors outside of the game itself, like heat stroke and heart failure, which would soon be factored into player safety. In the modern day, deaths like these thankfully are much rarer, though they still unfortunately happen. Even in the most recent season for 2024, a player in Alabama would pass away in hospice following an injury during a game a month prior. On the topic of non-fatal injuries, they too have been reduced, but still are on the minds of players and spectators alike. A study conducted by the NCAA between 2009 and 2013 looked into the concussion rate for players of various sports. Football saw a high level, with about 6.3 out of 10,000 players receiving a concussion during a game or practice. That's about double from sports like men's soccer, lacrosse, and basketball, and much higher than the 0.7 for baseball. It wasn't the highest. Ice hockey registered 8.2, but still high enough for concerns. As for the second point, the NCAA has been criticized on a number of fronts for their treatment of players. While they have improved player safety, many critics argue that they haven't been doing enough, most notably on its lax efforts regarding injury timeouts. On other fronts, the association has been accused of excessive profiteering from players, notably rearranging schedules for monetary value over fan engagement and prohibiting players from selling their likeness until a court ordered them to reverse it in 2021 despite the profits it racked in. These 2 points aren't directly connected to player safety, but are indicative of greater treatment. These 2 points heavily juxtapose the contents of the rest of the video, but they needed to be said. With all that, however, the game has been made far safer than it has since that 1904 meeting, and it was thanks to the efforts of the NCAA that they happened. Here's how. The 1906 changes to the game were some of the most drastic. The first of these was a restructuring of the field. It would still be 360 by 160 feet, aka 120 by 53 1/3 yards, that Camp set out. However, rather than having all 120 yards be used for running the ball, only the middle 100 yards would be used for that. The 10 yards at each end, dubbed the end zones, are now where the players would need to go in order to score a touchdown rather than running the ball out of bounds. As a bonus, a player forced to go out of bounds when they were in their own end zone was a new way for the defense to score a safety. The second innovation was a way for players to avoid the skirmish that would occur at the scrimmage whenever possible. At first, it was proposed to simply widen the field, but this proved too difficult as many schools had already built the stadiums in line with that narrow design. They instead came up with a new tactic, one so iconic that many places use it as the symbol for the game itself, the forward pass. Prior to its inclusion, football, like rugby, would only allow passes if they moved the ball perfectly perpendicular or backwards to the line of play. These passes, now called lateral passes, still occur often in football, but now, once per play and before the ball crosses the line of scrimmage, a player, usually the quarterback, could throw the ball forward towards another player, sailing over the chaos below. The defenses would still try to block this pass, but it would still be less dangerous than a dogpile before the forward pass's introduction. This could include attempting to block or tackle either player, intercept the ball itself, or even if the pass was successful, stopping the player from running further in a manner that didn't require them from stopping at full speed, such as trying to force them out of bounds. Along with being safer, it also changed the dynamics of play. The players that usually caught these passes were the ones positioned at the ends of the line of scrimmage. They would eventually be dubbed wide receivers as they go wide to receive the ball. A few other changes would occur. The game would now only be played for 60 minutes, divided into two 30-minute halves and further into 15-minute quarters. The 3 downs 5 yards would be changed to 3 downs 10 yards to allow for more room and therefore softer hitting. A few years later, a 4th down was added to put less pressure on the offense. Instead of both teams bumping into each other at the line of scrimmage, the defense would now need to maintain a small bit of distance to give players an opportunity to block with their hands and not their heads. This distance was the length of the ball, 11 inches or about 28 centimeters. The number of games a team could play per week was reduced to 1 as opposed to as many as 6 prior. Many rules would later be added that would penalize players for excessive force while playing, including roughing the passer, prohibiting the defense from tackling the quarterback if they have already thrown the ball. Scoring was also changed to incentivize scoring more touchdowns rather than field goals. Safeties remained at 2 points, while the field goal would now only be 3 points, a conversion would only be 1, and a touchdown would become 5 points, bumped to 6 in 1912. These are still the scores for each play today. Many of these decisions came from a man named John Heisman. If Camp was the father of American football, Heisman is the pioneer. He himself played the game during Camp's code and helped revolutionize not just football safety, but football tactics. As an example, Heisman pioneered the tactic of throwing the ball during the snap instead of just rolling. In acknowledgement of his achievements, since 1935, the NCAA awards a trophy that bears Heisman's name to the most outstanding player of each season. A few smaller changes would occur much later in the game's development, including moving the goalposts to the edge of the field rather than in front of the end zones to prevent collisions, adding a choice to instead get 2 points after a touchdown but performing another, and of course, the eventual mandating of wearing helmets and shoulder pads. However, the last big changes were those of Heisman, and by 1920, American football had calcified into a form that is almost identical to the game today. Just in time too. In that year, an organization would be formed to take the sport from collegiate to professional. Originally called the American Professional Football Association, it would change its name 2 years later to the name it has today, the National Football League, or NFL. So you've now listened to me yap for about 29 minutes about the history of college football without even beginning to explain what makes it so popular. I promise all that context was relevant to answer the question because that's the first reason: history. For the first 50 or so years of its history, football was almost exclusively played at the collegiate level. A player from that inaugural Princeton V Rutgers match could theoretically have a grandchild playing in college football before any sort of professional game was being played. For about a third of its history, playing at college wasn't just a definitive way to play the game, it was the only way. Even as the NFL was taking off in the 20th century, the practice of taking the family to the college game instead was well ingrained into the American psyche. After all, in some ways, college football is comparable in age to that of the Football Association or World Rugby. That leads to the second reason for college football's popularity. It's American. The US had experimented with both soccer and rugby as its definitive code, and instead chose to make its own. America's not alone in this, of course. Following the 1874 game with Harvard, McGill and the rest of Canada would eventually morph rugby into its own gridiron sport called Canadian football, which Canadians just call football. I briefly mentioned Australian rules football at the beginning of the video. That's a code Australia developed for itself using the dimensions of a cricket ground. It too is just called football, or footy since they're Australians, or Aussies. Even Ireland got its own just football, a homegrown mixture of soccer and rugby called Gaelic football, or Pêl Galach. It seems when you create a form of football of your own, you cherish it, and America is no exception. Also, given how stereotypically patriotic we are you really surprised of how much we adore a sport we invented? American pride is not the only factor in college football's popularity. School pride is too. That's even evident in the name we give our teams. I've already mentioned how Rutgers became the Scarlet Knights, but every other school has its own origin. Those schools I mentioned at the beginning? The Tennessee Volunteers got their name from the state's nickname, an allusion to Tennessee's willingness to volunteer for the Army and defend America in conflicts like in the War of 1812. The Texas Longhorns get their name from a popular breed of cattle in the area whose horns can grow upwards of 8 feet or 2.4 meters long. The Ohio State Buckeyes are named after an inedible nut used by the local Lenape people for medicine and leather making. And Alabama's name comes from the team's 1907 game against their eternal rival, Auburn University, where the players' uniforms got stained by the reddish mud. Pulling a draw in a game they seemed destined to lose, reporters stated how the team came in like a crimson tide to pull it off. College football and its team names give schools an opportunity to honor not just themselves, but the community and even the state they reside in. Along with pride, the sport also provides school notoriety. During the history portion, many of you are probably already very familiar with schools like Harvard and Yale. They are some of the most famous, prestigious, and high-quality schools not just in the United States, but in the world. Their accomplishments in the academic world are self-evident and don't need anything more to advertise themselves. Other schools, like the University of Michigan, aren't as lucky. Michigan is by no means a bad school, far from it. Two professors that taught in Michigan would be responsible for discovering the concept of quantum spin in electrons. John Abel, the pioneer of pharmacology and the first to crystallize insulin, graduated from there. And for other alumni, look no further than a US president, the Queen of Pop, and the voice of Darth Vader. All major accomplishments, but all too detailed and technical to implant into the layman's consciousness. If you have heard of the U of M, it's most likely because of its football stadium, Michigan Stadium, aka the Big House. With a capacity of over 107,000, it's the largest stadium in the US and third in the world. Named after the state animal, the stadium's tenants, the Michigan Wolverines, are an easy and simple way to both support and rep their school. Another famous alumni originates from the school's football program. Before he was the GOAT, the only football player many of you watching are familiar with, Tom Brady, was a Wolverine. In essence, football provides a clean entryway for university pride, for which the school can segue into lauding its academic achievements. If you're a bit skeptical about that, both the school itself and the team have their own mottos. Which do you remember and resonate with more? Artes Scientia Veritas, or Go Blue? Along with school pride, who doesn't love school rivalries? It's hard to say which school is better by something so broad and qualitative as academic accomplishments, but slinging mud over who got a better team is much easier. The Wolverines got some big rivals, the biggest of which is the aforementioned Buckeyes. Their rivalry is so grand it's simply called the game. Other schools have rivalries too. Many are responsible for a cornerstone term in American football, the bowl game. A bowl game is a special type of game played each season that has a commonality for each instance, usually either played in the same neutral venue or between the same two teams. The first instance of the term bowl in college football was the 1914 usage of the Yale Bowl, which was simply the name of Yale Stadium due to its resemblance to a dinner bowl. Later in 1922, the city of Pasadena, California would build its own football stadium outside any college campus. Due to its resemblance to the Yale Bowl and the allusion to the city's famous Parade of Roses, the stadium would be called the Rose Bowl. It would soon become home to many football games as a neutral site, with these games also being called Rose Bowls. Other similar bowl games would soon emerge, such as the Orange Bowl in Florida and the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. A few school rivalries would get on the bowl train too. The Alabama-Auburn rivalry I brought up is called the Iron Bowl. Neighboring Mississippi schools Ole Miss and Mississippi State have their Egg Bowl, and a personal favorite of mine, the Confusion Bowl. That one is played between the University of Miami and the University of Miami. That one is a bit cheating, though, since they only played 4 games against each other since 1946, and Miami won all 4 times. The bowl game is a time-honored tradition in American football and its origins in the college game. In fact, it's so important that all the big teams in the NCAA play in a grouping called the FBS, or the Football Bowl Subdivision. Yes, subdivision, I'll get to that later. Many of you might also be thinking about a different bowl game. I'll also be getting to that very soon. With all that's been discussed so far though, it simply touches the surface of why college football is as popular as it is. The reasons I've already discussed are simply to do with what it has done for itself, why it would be popular within the schools itself. To understand the broader appeal, you need to look at the actions of the NFL and how they influenced college football. Before I can explain the NFL's contributions to college football, I'll need to go on another tangent, albeit a much shorter one. This pertains to a particular aspect of the NFL and American professional sports more broadly that you may have been curious about. If you're from outside the United States and a big follower of soccer, your country probably doesn't just have one association football league, but multiple in a pyramid-like structure. In any given league, the teams that do the best are rewarded by going up a level, and the teams that do the worst are punished by going down. Promotion and relegation. You can even get in on the action. Just form a team to join at the bottom, and theoretically, your club could rise all the way to the top. American sports famously don't do that. They have a limited number of teams, they don't get relegated even if they lose every game in a season, and the league decides who, if anyone, can join. Seeing the other sports leagues in the country, our main soccer league, the MLS, copied them, and two have a closed league with no pro rel. While another soccer league, the USL, hopes to get pro rel into America for the first time by 2028, it's very obvious that the other sports won't be getting it anytime soon, if ever. You may scoff and say it's only because of corporate greed. While it's undoubtedly a small part of it, for the NFL in particular, there are far bigger reasons for it. The NFL's promotionless, relegationless, closed system was designed not out of greed, but out of necessity. For one, unlike many sports leagues around the world, when the NFL was forming, professional play in football was seen as distasteful. Part of it was due to the perception that being paid to play sports was seen as unsportsmanlike. That part isn't unique to American football. Rugby would eventually split into union and league in 1895 over that very issue. What was particular to America was another negative connotation about pro football. For a lack of a better word, it was seen as immature. Football was for college students. Adults should use their physicality for labor. So the NFL didn't get as popular as it is today because of the public, but in spite of it. A second issue was instability. The NFL wasn't the first crack at making football professional. Its predecessor, the Ohio League, tried to form a coherent structure for 17 years before folding in 1919. The big issue was that many of the teams, even extremely successful ones, couldn't seem to stay afloat. One of the inaugural members of the NFL, the Canton Bulldogs, would go on to be champions in 1922, 23, and 24, only to fold in 1927. In fact, of the original 14 teams to form the league, only 2 remain today. One of those to fold, the Chicago Tigers, didn't even make it to the end of the first season. Forming any type of pyramid in the system was nigh impossible when just one league was barely holding itself together with a rotating door of teams. The NFL would therefore continue this system of having everyone play at the same level, growing only when they wanted to expand to a new market, with the occasional absorption of smaller leagues that couldn't hold themselves together. Another league would eventually hold itself together long enough to be a big rival to the NFL's dominance. Starting in 1960, the American Football League, or AFL, would challenge the status quo set up by the NFL. They had some innovations to go with their skills, as they were the ones who first introduced the two-point conversion I previously mentioned into the game. It came to the point that the AFL was stealing players away from the NFL with lucrative deals. Both leagues quickly saw an issue though. They were too big fish in too small of a pond. If they kept fighting for dominance, they would threaten both of their existences. It soon became clear that the two leagues would merge into one. While I doubt Pro Rel was considered at the time, if there was a time to introduce it, it was here. There was just one problem. Both leagues were equally skilled. Prior to the merger starting in 1967, the two leagues would send their respective champions to play each other in exhibition games in what was then dubbed the AFL-NFL World Championship game. There was a perception that despite the AFL's quick rise, the NFL was objectively the more skilled league. That seemed to hold true, as the first meeting saw the NFL's Green Bay Packers beat the AFL's Kansas City Chiefs 35-10. The following meeting saw a similar result, with the Packers again beating the AFL's team, this time the Oakland Raiders, 33-14. It was the third outing in 1969 that saw a change in that perception. The NFL's Baltimore Colts were expected to beat the AFL's New York Jets, but the Jets would prove victorious instead, winning 16-9. The fourth game proved the Jets' victory wasn't a fluke, with the previously beaten Chiefs beating the NFL's Minnesota Vikings 23-7. In the 4 championship games pre-merger, both leagues would win 2 each. They would be admitted as equals of one league, and after a bit of shuffling around, they would instead form conferences bearing the names of the leagues that formed them, the NFC and the AFC. Post-merger championships saw similar results. The 5th game in 1971 saw the AFC win again, with the now transferred Baltimore Colts beating the Dallas Cowboys 16-13. But the NFC would show they still got game when those same Cowboys beat the Miami Dolphins 24-3. By the way, this championship game would get a new name by its third iteration. Since it was technically a rivalry between two leagues turned conferences often played in a neutral site, it was somewhat like a bowl game. It ought to be given a bowl name befitting of its grandeur. A Super Bowl, if you will. That structure post-merger would cement the NFL's closed league status. At the beginning of 1970, the NFL would have 26 teams. Since then, only 6 others would be added, too few to form a lower league, and many proving their worth on the top by being Super Bowl champions themselves. Now, other leagues are also closed and lack pro rel, but they technically could impose it at any time. Major League Baseball, for example, has a system called the minor league. In essence, it forms a pyramid for the sport with the MLB on top and progressively lower tiered leagues at the bottom. These leagues are not built for pro rel, but rather to develop players from the bottom up. For example, a player could start at the bottom, playing at the single A team, the Tampa Tarpons. If they're good enough, they could be promoted to the high A Hudson Valley Renegades, then the double A Somerset Patriots, the triple A Scranton Wilkes Barre Rail Riders, and finally all the way to the majors, where they play at the team that manages this whole farm system, the New York Yankees. Other leagues have similar, but less complex, development leagues. The National Hockey League has the American Hockey League, the National Basketball Association has its G League, and even the MLS uses its second level of the pyramid as a development league. All of these sports leagues could do away with the development league system and switch to a promotion-relegation system of sorts. All of them except the NFL. Unlike the others, the NFL doesn't have a development league. Those 32 teams are the only ones the NFL has, and it's the most it ever had. The NFL can't relegate teams that do poorly because there's nowhere to relegate to. There are other football leagues that can be considered minor, such as the UFL, but they are completely independent from the NFL. Breaking from the pro-rel talk, the NFL's lack of a development league means that they need a different system to find good players. They instead use something called a draft. Using a pool of up-and-coming players, each NFL team, starting with the team that did the worst the previous season, gets exclusive rights to grant one-year contracts to said players. The teams could then use said players to either put them in if they feel ready, or onto the practice squad to develop them further. The pool the draft draws from are players who have played, you guessed it, college football. That finally gets us to the first reason to how the NFL boosts college football: future prospects. If you want to see who will be the future players of the NFL, you best look at who plays in college now. It acts as the perfect substitute to any development league or sports academy that other games have, as the NFL has virtually no other means of getting new players. In fact, a bylaw the NFL has requires that all potential draft picks must be at least 3 years removed from completing their compulsory education, meaning in order for a hopeful player to be sharp enough for the league, it's best to continue playing the game in college. Let's talk a bit more about that draft, because it contributes to another reason to why people like college football. Lacking a promotion and relegation system, the NFL instead uses the draft to allow teams that did poorly to get first dibs on up-and-coming prospects. This prevents the top dogs from taking all the talent for themselves and making the game stale. This worked perfectly well for the NFL, but in some cases, a bit too well. To get an idea why, let's take a few games from the most recent NFL season. On November 24th, 2024, the Kansas City Chiefs would face the Carolina Panthers for each of their 12th game of the season. The Chiefs are top dogs in the league, winning 3 of the last 5 Super Bowls, including the last 2. They would eventually make it to the Super Bowl again this year, although they'd lose that one. The Panthers are the exact opposite. In the previous season, they finished dead last in the league and are on track to finish near the bottom this year too. This should not be a close game, and yet it is. The Chiefs only beat the Panthers 30-27. The Chiefs prevented this game from going into overtime with a literal last-second field goal. They had a good chance of losing said overtime, as the game's momentum was against them near the end. In the NFL, that's the thin line between the best and worst. While that game didn't become an upset, a game just 3 days prior did. Division rivals Pittsburgh Steelers and Cleveland Browns faced each other, with the Steelers being the clear favorites. They'd eventually win enough games to end up playing in the playoffs. The Browns, however, would finish the season winning only 3 games. Unfortunately for the Steelers, this was one of them, as a snowstorm mid-game led to a Browns victory 24-19. This was an upset, but perhaps not as big as you might think. In the previous matches these two teams faced each other prior to the game, the Steelers won 81 of them, the Browns 63, and tied a single time. Doing the math, you'd find that overall, this matchup would result in a Browns victory about 43.5% of the time, barely worse than a coin flip. To see a true upset, let's look at a college game that same year. On October 5th, Tennessee's Vanderbilt Commodores would host a team I mentioned a few times already, the Alabama Crimson Tide. Out of the 85 times the two schools faced each other prior, Vanderbilt only won 18 of them. That same math only gave Vanderbilt a 21% chance of victory. What's more, they were sitting at 2 wins and 2 losses. Alabama, on the other hand, were yet to be defeated this season, and at the time were considered to be the #1 team in the nation based on rankings. That made the Vanderbilt upset much more cathartic compared to the NFL matchup, where they beat Alabama 40-35. That type of underdog spirit and score variability is much stronger in college football than it is in the NFL, as the colleges usually convince players to join their school rather than simply getting to draft one onto a team. You may have also noted the higher scoring in the examples, as even the losing Alabama scored more points than any of the NFL teams I used as examples. If you really like your team, you want them to score more points, and the college game provides more of that than the professional game. As an extreme example to prove my point, a team getting 70 points in a game is a task that requires a lot of skill, even against weaker opponents. It requires you score 10 touchdowns with their respective extra points, about 1 every 6 minutes, all the while there are those trying to stop you and force you to make a field goal instead. In all the 17,950 games the NFL has played in its history, only 4 had a team score at least 70 points. In just the 2024 FBS season alone, there were 11, and in one of those, their opponents managed to score 50. Of course, a league isn't all beatdowns, but the fact that they can occur in such quantities compared to the NFL makes the scoring that much more unpredictable and exciting. You could be in the ballpark of where an NFL score would be. Good luck trying to do that with college football. Along with skill, the size of the NFL also boosts college football. The United States is a huge country that the league isn't even close to covering with its teams. To get an idea of that, let's compare the US to a couple other countries that structures its cities in a similar way. According to their 2021 census, Australia has 5 urban metropolitan areas that have a population of at least 1 million people. Canada's census say they have 6. Concatenate those two to give you America's number: 56 metropolitan areas of over 1 million per the 2020 census. As previously established, the NFL only has 32 teams, meaning many big cities aren't covered. If we add the teams from the lower league I mentioned earlier, the UFL, that only brings us up to 40. You need to add 16 more teams to have exactly 1 team for each of those metropolitan areas. That still won't cover all of them though, since some cities already have 2 teams, and if we move them around so that each metro has 1 team, that wouldn't cover the many other cities that are under a million. If we lower the cutoff to 500,000, our list expands to 107 cities. 32 seems to be the maximum number of teams for a professional league to operate in, as the NFL and others show. And it seems unlikely they would add a lower level, as neither team owners nor aspiring fans want to be denied an opportunity to win the Super Bowl. College football's massive number of teams fixes that, and I do mean massive. To compare, English football sees 20 clubs in its Premier League and 24 clubs in each of the leagues making up the EFL, totaling 92. If we add the National League's 24 into the mix, that bumps us up to 116 across 5 levels. In the upcoming 2025 season, the NCAA's FBS alone will have 136 teams, including 2 joining this year, all competing at the same level. With so many teams, it's much easier to satisfy so many media markets. This can be easily shown at the state level. Texas is notorious for how football obsessed it is, but with the rest of the country needing to be covered, the state can only host 2 NFL teams, nowhere near enough to cover a state with over 30 million people. College football covers those gaps with 13 FBS teams alone. Other states don't even have 1 NFL team. Virginia, South Carolina, and Alabama all have over 5 million people, but because they're spread out across too many smaller cities, none of them can support a professional team. But they can't support college football, hosting 5, 3, and 6 teams respectively. Even smaller states with under 2 million people like West Virginia, Hawaii, Delaware, and Wyoming get an opportunity to have a team or 2. And they'll have teams for years to come, as unlike NFL teams, they'll stay put. Because they only have those 32, the league prioritizes only the biggest and most fervent markets, which often change with the times. This often means that NFL teams can pack up their bags and move to another city. This traces itself back to the very beginning of the league. Remember those Canton Bulldogs I mentioned in the early history of the NFL winning 3 championships in a row? Well, for their last championship, they were actually the Cleveland Bulldogs. The 2 issues that plagued the league in the early years meant that in order to grow, the NFL had to be built not by the communities themselves, but by clever marketing. And when it's built on marketing, you need to sell to places that are willing to buy. These initial conditions made professional football fans in the US quite fair weather compared to the more ultra-heavy culture of other countries. Support grew when a team did good, waned when it didn't, and if it waned too much, moved the team elsewhere. English football fans were furious in 2003 when Wimbledon FC moved 56 miles or 90 kilometers to Milton Keynes, a move so offensive the FA hasn't approved a transfer such as that since. If you think that's far, check this out. One of the two founding teams of the NFL that survives today, the Cardinals, would have a lengthy move. Originally founded in Chicago in 1898, it moved to Racine, Wisconsin the following year, only to return to Chicago for the first NFL season. It then moved in 1960 to St. Louis to help the league expand nationwide. St. Louis didn't prove to be the permanent home of the Cardinals, however, as they again moved in 1988 to Phoenix, Arizona, where they remain to this day. That journey spans about 1,650 miles or 2,655 kilometers, and they are the only team to do so. And while fans do protest such moves, their fair weather nature means that there isn't enough passion to lock a team to a community in some cases. This is objectively greed, but it didn't develop from tricking fans. It was always like that in the NFL. The true passion you'd expect comes from the college game. Since they are tied to a university and therefore a community, these fans invest their sports passions into these collegiate teams without fear of them being shipped across the country. The combination of this passion and the mentioned size disparity leads to another aspect of college football's attention. For many players, this is their big break. The difference in the number of teams between the NFL and the NCAA means that less than 2% of college players go pro. And while a couple others can go elsewhere like the UFL, for the vast majority of players, this is the peak of their career. A player that falls into the 97th percentile for the entire sport can be great, excellent even, but just not quite enough to go pro. Americans want to celebrate these players, so for the 4 years they can play the game, let's make them rock stars. Two more points I want to make before I wrap up this ungodly long chapter. First, not exactly something that college football has over the NFL, but something they have in common. Each individual game means more. A charm that football has is that each season, a team doesn't play that many games. That may seem weird, but let's compare it to other professional sports leagues to show you what I mean. A standard NHL team will play 82 games in the regular season. The NBA has the same number. With about 30 teams in each league, that means teams will play each other multiple times per season. That's a lot, but nothing compared to the MLB, where each team has to play 162 games a season. 162 games over the course of 6 months. That's almost a game every day, and with 30 teams, that often means a team plays another upwards of 4 days in a row, then later in the season, those two play again at the other stadium, also 4 days in a row. That's not even getting to the playoffs, where all three leagues require teams to play a best of 7 for each round. That is upwards of 4 rounds and includes the championship. With so many games, so many of them just do not matter in the long run. The NFL, by contrast, only has 17 games per regular season, which is up from 16 the league had in 2020. Even if an alleged proposal goes through in the next few years to extend the season, it will only go up to 18 games. With so few games, each one matters. Even the playoffs work like this. All the rounds, including the Super Bowl, are one and done. College football is even more concentrated, just 12 games per season. This makes each and every one of those games just the more exciting and relevant. The final point I'll make is how football itself became the most popular sport in America, not just for college, but in general. For the longest time, it was baseball, not football, that was the most popular sport in America, at least on the professional level. It too is an American-made sport, and much older, with the modern form starting around 1845. It had a large and permanent effect on the American psyche. Earlier in this chapter, I used the phrase "in the ballpark" to mean an approximation. That comes from baseball, where a batter would hit the ball within a park as opposed to some of the hardest hits, which would send it so far that it flew out of the ballpark. But outside of vernacular, baseball would also affect other sports. You may have noticed that when Americans list scores, the home teams are on the right side, including all of the examples I listed in this video. Most countries have their home team on the left. For most sports, this decision is arbitrary, so most places simply list the home team first. Not baseball. They have good reason to put it on the right, or rather, the bottom. You see, thanks to baseball being divided into innings, one team would bat and the other would catch, and then they would switch. This system gave an advantage for going second. If after 9 innings the first team had less runs than the other team scored in only 8, the bottom of the 9th won't be played as the second team has already won and allowed them to save some energy. If the first was up or tied, however, the last inning allowed the second team one last chance to catch up. Home teams wanted that advantage for themselves, so they were listed at the bottom of scoreboards. This home team bottom and later right approach was later copied by other sports since, hey, that's what baseball does. No wonder baseball is still called America's favorite pastime. It was the top dog. So, what changed? One word: television. Baseball thrived in the era of newsprint and later the radio. You can see why if we compare the scorebugs that each sport shows when games are broadcast. Baseball's scorebug is rather simple. All you need is the score, the current inning half, which bases have a man on them, and the outs and strikes. All of these can be quickly called out on the radio by an announcer. The innings aren't timed, so there's no need for a clock, and you don't need to explain who's batting since it's evident by the inning half. Football's scorebug is far more complicated. To know what's going on, you need the score, the clock, the quarter number, which team has the ball, the down number, the yardage, the position of the line of scrimmage, and the number of timeouts each team has for a half. That's all the information a radio jockey needs to relay, and that's just the standard gameplay. You need more information for special cases, such as field goal attempts, a second clock indicating when play should resume, and whenever a penalty is called. This fact helped baseball dominate in the time of the airwaves, but when the TV came around, much of the information can be conveyed visually with the announcer only needing to explain some less obvious aspects. The NFL used this new technology to propel the sport above baseball. This came alongside the new Super Bowl championship. The league used it as half sporting event, half spectacle to captivate the television market, and it clearly worked. About a third of Americans watch the Super Bowl every year, making it the biggest televised program in the country every single year. This also happens to make it the most popular championship for a domestic league in the world. Every other championship that's more popular is international. That fact helped the NFL take over the MLB around the 70s, and that televised glamour trickled down to college football. Phew! That was a long segment. There's one more section we need to cover before we wrap this video up. This one won't be as long, I promise. The reasons I listed so far are self-reliant on how they boosted college football's popularity. The remaining reasons are predicated on it being popular already and boosting it to higher levels. If you were to look at a typical NFL season schedule, you'd notice that most games were played on Sundays, with the occasional Thursday and Monday night game. That's kind of weird, right? If football is so popular in America, wouldn't it be better to play on Fridays and Saturdays? Well, the NFL legally can't. In 1961, Congress passed a law called the Sports Broadcasting Act. It had two functions. The first and primary purpose was to amend antitrust laws surrounding sports to allow leagues like the NFL to pool broadcasting rights as a collective rather than each team doing so on its own. Basically, the teams are not their own individual company, rather different products from the same company. It's the second purpose that is of interest to us. During Friday nights after 6 p.m. local time and Saturdays between mid-September and mid-December, the NFL is prohibited from broadcasting any games if there's a college or high school game happening within 75 miles or 120 kilometers of the home stadium. As you'd expect, that pretty much covers the entirety of the United States. And since most people see games through broadcast, that essentially bans the NFL from operating on those 2 weekdays. If you do see a Friday or Saturday game, it's either near Christmas time when the curfew is dropped, or for a particular Week 1 game before it kicks in. This technically applies to other leagues too, but the times listed in the law particularly targets the NFL the most. This helped establish a timeline for football in the US through the week. Fridays are for high school games, Saturdays are for college, and Sundays are for pros. Therefore, to keep the ever-popular college football going, and not for it to get encroached on by the NFL, it got a little help from the law. Emphasis on the little, because college football can mostly handle itself just fine. I implied at the very beginning of the video that it had a higher attendance than the NFL. That's half true. The average attendance of all regular FBS games for 2024 was 40,492. For that same year, the NFL saw 69,555 attendance per game, over 70% more. That's because while college football has stadiums that are much larger than the NFL, it also has many that are much smaller. 2 FBS schools, Kennesaw State and Sam Houston, have stadiums with a capacity of less than 15,000. That's even smaller than even the minimum requirement that the US Soccer Federation states a top league stadium requires, and about a fifth of the size of the smallest stadium in the NFL, Chicago Soldier Field. So the big and small stadiums cancel out. Still, over 40K is impressive. The NFL is the most attended league in the world by average attendance. The next league on that list, the Bundesliga, has an average attendance of 39,512 in its most recent season. That's less than the FBS, meaning that if it was a professional sports league, it would be second in the world. While the Bundesliga had a slump for that season, college football had a slight one too. There are occasionally years where the Bundesliga overtakes it, but just barely. Quite an impressive feat to maintain a comparable average compared to a professional league while having 7.5 times as many teams. By raw totals, the FBS would also be second if it was pro, about 32.5 million, beaten only this time by the MLB's 71.3 million. Even more impressive considering the MLB only manages just above double the attendance while playing over triple the number of games. Back to average attendance, the true big numbers come when you look at the individual conferences. With so many teams, college football is divided up into regional conferences, so teams usually play amongst other teams in the same region with the occasional long-distance team. And no conferences are as grand as the Power Four, all of them with a much higher average attendance than the Bundesliga. Admittedly, these numbers are a bit outdated from 2014, but they should be comparable to what goes on today. The smallest of these is the Atlantic Coast Conference, or ACC. As the name suggests, most schools are near the Atlantic on the East Coast, and they have an average attendance of 50,291. That's already higher than the Bundesliga ever had in its history. Above them is the Big 12, concentrated around the American Southwest and with an average attendance of 58,102. It's the youngest of the four, just formed in 1994, and originally had 12 teams, though now it expanded to 16. It copied its naming scheme from the oldest of the Power Four, the Big Ten. It's concentrated in the Midwest and has an average attendance of 66,869, almost on par with the NFL. That's not a big surprise, as the Midwest is the reason why football spread so far. It is the first place outside of New England for football to get going, and the 10 original members would found the Big Ten all the way back in 1893, even before the NCAA was a thing. If we go back to the list of stadiums in the opening, the largest three, Michigan, Beaver, and Ohio, all belong to Big Ten schools. I mentioned Michigan Stadium earlier. It's top of the list for a reason. Starting in 1975, the Big House would host 306 games in a row that have an attendance of over 100,000. This streak was only broken in 2020 because of the pandemic. The Midwest's fascination with football is evident in many other ways. Most of the early NFL teams were concentrated in the Midwest, and its predecessor was literally called the Ohio League. Ohio even hosts American football's Hall of Fame. The Midwest is obsessed, but one region still beats it: the South. Obsession is perhaps not the right word. Devotion is more like it. The South's main conference, the Southeastern Conference, or SEC, is by far the most popular. It has an average attendance of 77,694, even higher than the NFL's. Those last 5 stadiums on the list are all SEC. Those 2 rivalries I mentioned, the Iron and Egg Bowls, SEC schools. That Vanderbilt upset I used as an example? Between SEC schools. A quarter of all active NFL players right now come from the SEC, despite only having 16 teams. No wonder the SEC's motto is, "It just means more." The South's devotion started out in football's developmental years, where between 1892 and 1927, a man would coach various schools in the region, such as Auburn, Clemson, Georgia Tech, and Rice. He was quite good at it too, leading those teams to become top of their game and the rest of the South following suit. Of course, it helps that man was the aforementioned pioneer of football, John Heisman. Now, the popularity of football in the region is also tied to the South's history and culture. The states that made up the South, of course, were all part of the Confederacy and fought against the Union during the Civil War. That, with a few other factors, cast a cloud of shame over the South from other states. But no one likes to be down all the time, and the South has quite a unique culture for itself, so they take pride in the positive aspects. They have a robust cuisine, they're the birthplace of jazz, and they play dang good football, especially the college game. Let's take a look at those states that make up the South again. We'll exclude Texas and Florida in this to prove a point. These 10 states collectively have a population of over 61 million people, with about 18.5% of the population. Based on population alone, these states collectively should have 6 of the NFL's 32 teams, maybe a couple more due to their obsession with the game. They have 4. Quite the underrepresentation. Looking again at the NCAA's FBS teams, these 10 states collectively have 43 out of 136 teams, almost a third. Regionalism from the South, as well as the Midwest, drive much of college football's high rate of popularity. Back to that FBS usage, I promised I was going to explain that. The Football Bowl subdivision, as the name implies, means that those 136 teams we were talking about aren't the only teams. The NCAA originally had all their football teams play at the same level. That was until 1973, when so many schools were playing, they had to be separated. That year, the schools were split into 3 divisions, which in essence are like levels in a pyramid. In 1978, the top division, Division I, would split further into Division A and Division AA. The former would later be renamed to what it is today, the FBS, while the latter would be dubbed the FCS, the Football Champions subdivision. Many of the schools we're talking about in the history chapter, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Princeton, play in the FCS. Not Rutgers though. They got the last laugh over Princeton and play in the FBS with the big boys. Those lower divisions aren't as popular as the FBS, obviously, but they help fill the niches that even they can't fill in sport. Using Texas as an example again, along with those 13 FBS schools, the state also has 10 FCS schools, 6 Division II schools, and 9 Division III schools. There is technically a kind of pro-rel in the system, but it works very differently. Schools can transfer between divisions. The 2 new FBS inclusions for 2025, Delaware and Missouri State, are both transferring from the FCS. However, transferring requires much more than simply finishing first or last. Even if a team finishes 1-11 in a season, they at least beat one team, probably one with a better record, so they are in the right division overall, and their fortunes can change. You need to be consistently dominant or consistently dominated in order to be considered for change. This usually happens after an understanding by both the school and the NCAA in a you-know-it-when-you-see-it situation. Speaking of the NCAA, they aren't the only organization with football. The National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, or the NAIA, originally founded in 1940 by basketball inventor James Naismith, was originally designed for his sport, but would expand to include football in 1856 to allow schools under their program to participate. The NAIA includes a lot of schools that aren't under the NCAA banner, including many historically black colleges. Other collegiate athletic organizations, like the NCCAA and the NJCAA, have college football programs for predominantly Christian and community colleges respectively, so they too can get in on the action. There are even programs for American college football outside the United States. Mexico plays college football via ONEFA, the UK has its British Universities League that includes promotion and relegation, and over in Asia, both Japan and South Korea play in their respective associations. Fun fact about these two I found interesting, they have fully embraced all the college football traditions America has to offer. They even have their own bowl games. One of each that these countries have is, and I'm not making this up, the Rice Bowl and the Kimchi Bowl. 2 more points before we wrap up. First, did you notice how the NAIA started out for basketball, but later added football under its umbrella? The NCAA does that too. In fact, outside of football, the organization offers 17 other collegiate sports for men and 21 for women. The initial boost the league got allowed it to popularize other sports in college and in turn across the country. Along with their development leagues, other major sports leagues can also get players from their draft system thanks to the NCAA. Each of these are also divided into divisions 1, 2, and 3, though the top division being divided in half is unique to football. The division level of other sports also matches that of football, although one sport might be promoted higher by itself if a school is particularly good at it. They also share a nickname. For example, Michigan's basketball team is also called the Wolverines. This shared connection helps bring other sports in when otherwise there's no infrastructure to support them. You see, to help boost their teams, schools will offer scholarships to players to attend their schools. Of course, these students need to actually get a degree and maintain sufficient grades, but this is a key factor on how these programs get ahead of the others. In 1972, Congress passed a law called Title IX, which in essence banned any form of discrimination in higher education on the basis of sex. This includes said scholarships. Title IX requires schools to send out an equal number of sports scholarships to both men and women. That was a problem since football, thanks to its extremely physical nature, only had a men's program. To comply with the law, the NCAA would play a sport that women could play in a similar vein: soccer. Yes, after almost a century of absence, soccer was back in American universities. More sports would later be added, many of them female-dominated, which paved the way for a men's soccer program. The inclusion of soccer in the NCAA would also pave the way for the introduction of professional leagues such as the MLS and USL, and it's all thanks to college football. And one final point for the road, also relating to other sports, revenue. In 2016, a whopping 85% of all profits generated from all NCAA sports came from football. That's just how dominant the game is in college. The remaining 15%, incidentally, came exclusively from men's basketball. A few collegiate baseball teams break even, but for the most part, these are the only 2 sports that make a profit. Every other men's program and every single women's program operates at a loss. That means, basically, football and men's basketball subsidize all the other sports for equipment, training, and facilities, and football is doing the heavy lifting. If you want your team to have good training and good stuff, root for a touchdown. Over the course of an hour and change, I brought together all the pieces we need to answer the question, why is college football so popular in America? Honestly, I probably also answered every other question you had about the sport along the way too. Its storied history cemented itself into the cultural zeitgeist of the country. It's not just any sport, it's a game we created for ourselves with our blood, sweat, and tears. One that we fought to improve every step along the way in both entertainment and safety. Hard not to be patriotic about that. It also boosted the pride we had in our schools. It's an easy way to introduce our school's achievements before getting into the more intellectual points, and it's an easy way to maintain a school rivalry. When the NFL came along, we first clung to tradition as the old way of doing it. But soon, college football saw a huge boost from the league. Its draft system meant that watching the collegiate sport meant seeing future pros. Those who didn't make it at least got their spotlight in the college game. Thanks also to the draft, it means that often there's a lot more chaos and therefore excitement at the university level, and the NFL's size means that a community is more likely to root for said university over a pro team. A team, mind you, that the community has no nightmares of one day packing up and leaving. There are things that the two share though. Football's shorter season means more meaningful games, and thanks to the advent of television, it allowed the sport to rise above all others in America. With college football already popular, other factors would eventually compound that. A 1961 law would give it that ever little bit of protection from the NFL that it needed for set television. Its popularity rivals that of professional leagues, in no small part to heavily devoted regions such as the Midwest and especially the South, both who made heavy contributions to the sport. The ever-growing popularity caused lower leagues to spur out to provide the ever-smaller communities with a team too. Other organizations outside the NCAA got in on the action to get more eyeballs on college, including a few outside of the states. This popularity would in turn boost and include other sports on the collegiate and later the professional levels, which brought on a load of gratitude. What's more, college football's apparent ability to print money allows said collegiate programs to thrive in their own right, adding a cherry on top to all this. I didn't make this video to personally convince you to watch college football, nor to ridicule any other sport. If it doesn't appeal to you, that's perfectly fine. I just know that to an outside observer, it seems almost impossible to comprehend why American football can be so popular here, and especially the collegiate variety. I thank you for being curious enough to seek an answer to that question. With all the reasons I have provided to you, it should now be obvious. I'm K-Shy, and thank you for watching.